So over the years of leading men and women, coaching men and women on how they can lead together, I've read and learned about lots of great tips of leadership, lots of different things that we can do, and we'll explore some of these in our other conversations. But I think we want to start someplace a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, when I've looked at leadership and we talk about it, when I'm teaching leadership, we look at all sorts of angles of analyzing organizations and structures and character and nuances. But I don't actually think we look at the male and female dynamics as much as we should. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of hear from you. I'm curious to hear from you, like what you have to say about, what you've observed, because I think some things, are kind of behind the scenes and creep up and they affect us because we haven't really looked at what's going on.
Yeah, so I'd like to take the approach in this first conversation to say, what about the myths that we've come to believe about men and women leading together? And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. What do you think about the idea of us approaching it as a myth rather than a truth?
No, I think that's helpful. I think there may be things that I haven't noticed, and so it'll be good for me to look at them. And I do think, putting something out there and saying, I think this is a myth, people, that can actually be really stimulating and helpful for us to be like, oh yeah, I have been believing that, or I have been acting on that. So we'll see whether that's the case here.
Yeah, great. So we hope this opens up some dialogue for you as we dialogue together about this. So let's go through the myths. Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, myth number one. We're just going to start out with the myth that some believe, which is that men and women can't lead together. Maybe if you're taking this course, then you don't assume that. You're hopefully assuming that it can be different. But I bet it doesn't take long to think through experiences where you've realized someone might believe this myth. Hopefully it hasn't been us. We do know that this is a pervasive belief amongst many different people, depending on what type of views they hold. And they sometimes actively prevent women from leading in different situations, even if it's in coming alongside men in different spaces. So I just wonder if there's times that people would recognize, no matter what your theological perspective, are there ways that men and women could really lead together healthily? Because I think that it is a myth when it comes to it practically, because I've seen so many times that men and women can lead really well together. Even in the corporate world, there sometimes is this hierarchy that seeing this team leadership that we've been trying to talk about so far, it seems kind of rare. Additionally, some people have seen so few examples of men and women leading together well, and when they did see it, maybe they got a negative impression for some reason. I think that these are the realities that keep this myth alive and well in the minds of hearts of people that even are really well-meaning people.
Studies show that mixed gender organizations often are the most successful, and we see Jesus palling around with a group of men and women. And if you say, he had 12 male disciples because males are the best leaders, recall that Judas Iscariot was one of them. Maybe there is more of a consensus than we think that men and women can lead together. But many imagine that leadership has to do with ordering people around, or men are the big aggressive ones to do that commanding and yelling. And therefore, women end up in some sort of a subservient, timid, assistant, child-minding, food-serving, doer-not-thinker role. No, leadership is about helping a group get something done. Men and women should and can work together to do that.
Myth number 2, the future is female. Perhaps this is a slogan that you've heard or seen on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt or something like that. It goes back to the 1970s, and it's been an encouragement, in all honesty, to many women who have felt underheard, have not felt represented. And I don't have any interest in taking the wind out of anyone's sails who, are using that term to try to empower discouraged women. I can see why this phrase has been meaningful to some people. But like many often used slogans, printing it on a t-shirt doesn't make it true. Sometimes I hear a suggestion like, if women ruled the world, then things would be better. Well, I think there's a lot more room at the table for women at almost every table in the world. If women had absolute power, I do believe that it would corrupt absolutely, just like it does in the hands of male leaders. I deeply hope that we can see that more and more women leading in all spaces in society is what's best so that we can lead together. As Jesus followers, the vision of a future new creation where all that God created good is there together, we see this restoration picture. All the things that were cursed in the beginning of Genesis, we see completely restored. And I think that includes the relationship between men and women. And so that future is male and female, is female and male. a new and improved version of Genesis 1 and 2 with men and women co-laboring and co-working with God, just like we walked at the beginning in the garden. People walking with no shame and no desire to power over, as the Genesis 3 curse promises that we'll desire to do until God's kingdom does come fully.
Yes, agreed, Stephanie. There is gender conflict in the Garden of Eden. He will rule over you, Genesis 3:16. But that curse is not something to be accepted as good. Jesus says lording authority over others is what the pagans do and is not the way he himself is demonstrating or commending. No, the prophecy in Joel is that in the last days, when the Spirit comes, your sons and daughters will prophesy, as we see quoted in the sermon in Acts 2:17. Jesus says at the resurrection there will be no concern about marriage roles, Matthew 22:23-30. As Paul puts it, there is neither male nor female divisions in Christ Jesus, Galatians 3:28.
That brings us to myth number 3. The transition to co-leadership is too hard and it's not worth it. It doesn't mean it's not hard, but it is worth it. This myth is one that's kind of favored to the people that are just really practical. They want to say, look, it's hard, ministry is hard enough, work is hard enough, leading in the marketplace is hard enough. That the way that structures will need to change, the adaptive leadership needed to move teams to go from just men or just women to both men and women leading together, it is hard work. The excuses are kind of easy to find. For instance, how will we have the same intimacy on the team when it becomes both genders? How will meetings and conferences and traveling, the way we have done that, how will that need to change? What about the people who believe myth number 1? How are we going to deal with those people? They believe that men and women can't lead together. I mean, the list could go on as to why it might be a challenge. Every organization, as it grows and changes, needs to find the right pace of change for any transformation that's needed, and this one is no exception. It's also important to note that those who have not seen themselves represented might be a little bit hesitant at first to step into a role when they're asked at first. Some deeper discussion and multiple respectful requests might be needed for an underrepresented person to use their voice even around the table. It's difficult, but it's necessary to accept a no when someone chooses not to be the first person of difference to enter a room, because some of us don't know exactly what that really feels like to have that experience so often. But the reality is that often the most important and meaningful change and growth is the most difficult and complex. We get the chance, though, to join God in reversing the Genesis 3 curse one day at a time, even if it's tough, knowing that brokenness is not the end of God's story. No matter how much time it will take and how many courageous conversations might need to be had, it is worth it.
Yes, we are to go to the trouble and the hassle and the process that will be a little challenging to integrate and encourage a diverse group of people to work together. We see Paul saying that to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 12, that they're to see the different parts of the body of Christ as each contributing something valuable. We see in Romans 12, Paul encouraging the people in that church to do whatever they do well for the sake of the community and for God's purposes. So we can consider the history of how our forefathers marginalized women and people of color and try to hire and recruit people to make up for that to some extent. The social science research suggests generally that diverse teams make better decisions. But in itself, diversity of gender and race and age and marital status, social status, other kinds of differences in itself does not provide Jesus-like character and good decision making. So in addition to hiring and making intentional strides toward hiring a diverse group of people, we'll then have to do all those regular good leadership things of working together, pursuing good character, and communicating with each other and working well together.
Myth number 4, policies and rules will prevent problems. Policies and rules will prevent problems. It seems at first like this is not a myth, but I actually think that it is. When considering how teams will shift and change when both genders are at the table, it often becomes clear that some policies may need to be put in place to create really clear expectations for your organization. And I think that's a good thing. I'm an advocate for healthy, thoughtful policies, and I know Andy is as well. However, the deepest problems won't be prevented because of like a well-worded policy. That's just the reality. There is only one thing that's going to prevent potential problems that could arise from men and women being together on a team. And that one thing is character. It's the character of the people on the team. Character is what prevents the worst case scenarios that come to mind, which are easy to name, right? Affairs, assault, harassment. Policies can be helpful guardrails, but they can also be harmful when we're not careful to observe the outcomes that come from policies. For instance, a policy about men and women not traveling together might be wise at first. However, the time that I spend with my female interns traveling to conferences or speaking engagements, these are rich mentoring opportunities when those women get to travel with me. So it's up to me as a senior leader to be creative about how I can also invest in my male interns and the men that I lead in other ways if that's going to be a policy as a part of an organization.
I agree, Steph. Edifying speech rather than vulgar, crude talk are big principles the Bible talks about. One study did show that clear guidelines about what was appropriate speech helped men and women operate with less fear and more creativity. So those general guidelines are really helpful. A rule not permitting sexual immorality or getting drunk would generally just echo Scripture. The problem is that these really extensive policies, the bans on texting or riding together or eating together that are trying to build this big fence around what is basically good character. They're trying to prevent sexual vulgar language or immorality or drunkenness, but they also then end up being this massive web of policies and procedures that end up really hampering working together on a team. So it's tricky. So I do agree with you that it's character, not so much this just thick policy book.
All right, final myth, number 5. Men and women can't truly mentor each other. Men and women can't truly mentor each other. I define mentorship as investing leadership wisdom, sharing experience, and giving advice to other leaders. It's so important for leaders of both genders to be mentored and to be a mentor to those of the opposite sex, in my opinion. Will this need to look different, and will we need to be creative to do this well and in a healthy way? Yeah, of course we will. But that doesn't mean that we can't do it effectively. There have been so many times when a man has told me how the first spiritual conversations that he had in his life were with the women in his life, his mom, his auntie, his grandma, his female Sunday school teacher. This means that those men might be inclined to have spiritual conversations with women in their life, and it could be one of their pastors. Additionally, statistics prove how important having healthy relationships with men are, specifically for women, especially as they're growing up. And as we become adults, this need to be invested in by the opposite gender doesn't change, I don't think. It may need to look very different, but the need remains. We also have the opportunity to do what many call being a sponsor for other people who are maybe less experienced or aren't as networked as a leader might be. When I suggest one of the men I mentor to speak at a conference or at an event, or maybe I make a connection with him with a future employer, I'm taking mentorship to the next level and sponsoring that leader. Mentorship and sponsorship are needed for most leaders to be able to reach their potential, and we need to see that happen for men and women towards each other.
I agree, Steph. We should not hamper the foundations of working together as a team. I'm struck by the food laws that divided Jew and Gentile, that Jesus challenged, and then Paul and the early apostles really turned over. Paul told Peter he was wrong for participating in that kind of division. The food laws were intended to keep the Jews as a distinct people. It hampered their ability to socialize or develop friendships with non-Jews. The Spirit communicated clearly to Peter in Acts 10 that he needed to have a meal with Gentiles. Paul, too, in 1 Corinthians 10:27, insisted that conversation with people was actually more important than purity. Again, it is not to say that purity, and here we're talking now about relationships between men and women, is not important. It is important. The problem is that the fencing far around, let's say having a meal together, emphasizes purity to the extent that it hampers even positive, healthy, collegial, peer, kind, mentoring, sponsoring types of relationships.
So those are the 5 myths that I see. There might be other myths that you see, that you observe, that might be helpful to name. In fact, if you see these types of myths or others emerge in your context, I encourage you to say something. Calling them out is a step towards truths and opportunities that we will experience if we are willing to stay committed to leading together well. In my life, co-leading with men, there certainly have been many challenges, but I'm more convinced than ever that it's worth it. Not only for our current experiences, but for those who are going to come behind us.
Steph, I think those are really helpful, those myths. It just strikes me that, one, some people might disagree with us a little bit here. We've been sort of, these are controversial. These are sensitive topics. And yet, I think it's really helpful. I think what these 5 myths have in common is that they're like these sweeping generalizations, like people have had a bad experience with men and women working together, and so they're just like, men should not they should not mentor each other. We need rules. Forget all men. The future is female.
They're so reactive. It's so reactive.
Yeah. So I think it's helpful. We've probably pushed people a little bit to have conversations about the nuances here of like, rather than just like some person angrily says, from now on, we're never doing this again. It's like a more like conversational approach that, because we would like men and women to lead in a healthy way together.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to take more thoughtfulness from all of us in how we approach these decisions, how we approach conversations, how we approach policies and procedures, all of the things we just talked about. It's going to take us turning up quite a few notches of the thoughtfulness and the intentionality. And we're going to talk about that as we go throughout the course, just a little bit more practical, kind of what does this look like? How can we live this out? Wrestle with these myths. We'd love to hear what you think. And if you've noticed any other myths that people are believing. But our biggest goal here is just to say, let's continue to be really thoughtful, and that's going to be a real healthy path forward. Mm-hmm.